Now I introduce you Dr. Cristina López del Burgo, Dr. Cristina López del Burgo, Professor in Medicine at the University of Navarra, Master in Sexual Health, expert in human sexual health, Professor of Preventive Medicine of this university in the UNED, and she's part of the research team, Education of Fertility, and of the Human Sexuality of the Culture and Society Institute with Joaquín de Irala Institute.
Firstly, many thanks to the organizers for allowing me to participate. I'm going to move directly into the presentation because, as you can see, we are late, running late. Well, the apps that exist in the market, fertility apps or mobile phone apps, I mean, can be used to become or to avoid pregnancy. So when Dr. Chiva entrusted me with this session, so what I did, like all women do, is go to the internet to search for the best apps. And this is a report from the Ola magazine, strangely enough. And here we had apps for people that wanted to become pregnant. I did the same search in English. And yes, well, there were quite a few dissemination articles on the best apps. And here they did also specify that most, well, these are apps to identify the fertility window, but what they said is that it was best not to use it if you wanted to avoid becoming pregnant. And this is what you can find when you do an internet search. And this is another example of an app. And in this app, the woman does register the fertility indicators. And, well, you can see that this is similar to the charts we saw before, but instead of doing so on paper, which is what we did years ago, now there are apps. You enter your indicators and you can generate a chart. So when I started to look into this issue, I considered several options. And firstly, what is the real efficacy of the algorithms used by the apps? Because at the end of the day, these are algorithms. And do we have to bear in mind the popularity these apps have? Because are the most popular apps the most efficacious ones, or is it the opposite? And I also wanted to see if they were supported by experts in reproductive health and if there was any kind of support. In other words, if there was anybody to consult with when the indicators are being recorded. And there's something that is pretty significant that we sometimes forget about, that it slips the mind, and this has to do with privacy and data safety. What's going to happen with my data? In other words, the small print that we never read when we download an app. So what are they going to do with the data? So as we are at a top quality conference, I didn't just focus on what I found on the internet, and I did a search in the scientific literature to see what had been published on these apps. So this is one of the first revisions that was published in 2016, where they referred to apps to avoid pregnancy. So they applied a number of quality criteria to these apps that they evaluated. And what they found is that most of these apps were not based on the natural methods that we've already heard about during the conference. And many of them carried a warning of don't use it to prevent pregnancy. And one of the recommendations that was made in this revision is that if you are going to be using these apps, and considering that they are not very reliable, that's what they found when they analyzed them, well, it would be much better to first interpret your cycle, that somebody teach you a method, and it would be better to use them as a support. This was published in 2016, but in that very year, in 2016, there was another revision that also followed other criteria to rate the applications as to whether they are accurate or not. And they came to the same conclusion, and that is that most of these apps are not accurate. They don't accurately identify the fertility window, and that there are very few apps that are endorsed by healthcare professionals, by specialists of reproductive health, which is, I think, a pretty significant thing. And then later on, in 2018, there was another revision published, in this case, to help conception with these apps. And, well, we had the same thing again. And I think that it's important to underscore this, and that is that ovulation cannot be predicted. Ovulation is something that we can observe because we don't know what's going to happen in our body. We don't know if the cycle is going to be short, or if it's going to be long, or whether we're going to ovulate or not. So it's interesting to bear this in mind and to point this out to these women. Although what they did conclude after revising these apps, they came to the conclusion that said that for those women that do want to conceive, they can be helpful. But we go back to what we said before. It's always preferable to learn to understand what's going on in your body, and the app can give you a helping hand with that. What is equally important, which I've pointed out here in blue, what these authors recommended after reviewing these apps, is that it would be interesting to carry out studies, independent studies, on the industry that is behind these apps. And this also dates back to 2018, and it's another study that was published on whether the apps predict. Well, look, they use the verb to predict. Do they predict ovulation with accuracy? And after, in this case, I think it was, I can't remember if it was a specific app. No. What they were doing is revising different apps. What's interesting is that none of them explained the methodology that was followed in detail, nor the algorithms that they were using. And the conclusion they came to is that ovulation, well, we know that ovulation is variable. We know that these cycles do, well, sometimes you ovulate earlier and other times you ovulate later. But what we can't do is just rely on the duration of the cycle to calculate or to predict ovulation, because this is something that everybody is familiar with. So the conclusion is still the same one. This is more recent, 2020. This is another revision on these apps. And, well, the conclusion was exactly the same. That is that the scientific studies that evaluate the apps are very scarce. So studies that have been published, that have been revised, and that have been published in scientific journals are very limited. Although what is interesting is the fact that, well, one of the things that they do point out in this study is that we, the women, want the app to be reliable, and they are usually not regulated by anybody. So we came to the same conclusion. In 2021, of the most recent revision, it was exactly the same thing. And I'm going to go through this very quickly because I'm halfway through the lecture. So these are the only apps that we have at our disposal. And we have studies published in scientific journals, and the rest of them are published on the websites of the apps, or only these are published in scientific journals. And the first one, this was the first one that was published. This is supported by the FDA, at least it has been acknowledged by the FDA, and it's based, what it uses for its algorithm is temperature registers and the duration of cycles. This is the scientific paper on that app. It dates back to 2016. Where they found practical efficacy of 7, the Pearl rate, and that would be 93%, and a theoretical efficacy that is very high of 0.5. And, well, the conclusion was that it seems that the app improves the efficacy of natural methods. So it's a technical success. And this was criticized quite a lot. This is one of the letters to the editor. And in fact, it was written by Joseph Stanford, among other people. And in it, what they do, well, what they were discussing here, and here we'd have to talk about the methodology of the research done, but this study had quite a few methodological issues. It had a bias in the selection of the sample, and the most important thing is that they didn't properly evaluate, or they didn't properly detect those pregnancies that had happened. So we are dealing here with a number of methodological constraints that mean that we cannot feel at ease with these efficacy figures. And somewhat later on, they published another study on the same app, and they obtained the same efficacy figures. But they were still using the same methodology they were using in the previous study. In other words, we still have the same problems. And in fact, there was another letter to the editor pointing out these problems, the problems related to this study. And it's the same thing because they were applying the same methodology, but with another sample of women.
Había conflictos de intereses en esos estudios.
And what was important is that there was a conflict of interest in these studies. And this is another one. This is from this year. It was published this year, where they obtained the same efficacy figures, and they still use the same methodology. So the conclusion, well, you yourselves can draw the conclusions. And this is another one with the same app. The same effectiveness, but also the same way of measuring and calculating efficacy. So we still have the same limitations. This is another app, those that are available. We do have a scientific study on it, and it also bears in mind the duration of cycles and temperature. And on the website, they say that it's a very safe ovulation calculator with an accuracy in excess of 90%. But this scientific paper, wasn't quite along the same lines. And they considered that once it was published, they considered it to be invalid or non-valid because of a number of methodological problems. And the authors did not agree with this retracting. I'm not sure if I'm using the right term. But anyway, and this is what appears in the journal, and they considered that we couldn't really rely on that article because of methodological issues. And, well, the methodological issues of this study are very similar to those of the previous app that I showed you before. And here, this is something that they just published this year, and, well, it's another study with this app. And what they concluded in this case is that the app is able, because this is based on temperature readings, and it's capable of detecting two-phase cycles. In other words, it can tell whether a cycle is ovulatory or not, but they are not telling us in this study if it does determine the fertility window, and it doesn't say anything about effectiveness either. So it really doesn't make a big contribution in terms of information. And this is another app that has been recognized by the FDA, and it has been recognized as a contraception method. And in this case, 2 minutes, okay, right, well, they use an algorithm. They use an algorithm to predict ovulation, but it can only be used by women with regular cycles. And what they advise is that they use condoms when in a fertile period. These are the figures of effectiveness, and they are pretty high, between 1 and 1.5%. And by analyzing the study, there was a sensitivity analysis, and the efficacy or effectiveness was somewhat reduced a little bit. And then only half of them managed to cover the 3 follow-up cycles. And of those that left the study, 25% was because of irregular cycles, so they couldn't use the app. So this is an interesting thing. And this is, however, to conceive. It's clear blue. I suppose that rings a bell, so that you can detect ovulation. It's connected to an app. And, well, I'm not going to dwell on that. And then there were some other studies released that also evaluate whether these apps are useful to conceive. And they did find that there are people that did manage to get pregnant by using these apps, especially what they do is detect ovulation. So this is another aid. And if you teach the woman to identify her fertile periods, she has more possibility of conceiving. And I'm going to speed this up a bit. Well, this paper is from September the 10th. I was just finishing with the presentation, and it's available on the internet, and I would like to encourage you to read it because I found that it was very interesting, because it does say what these fertility apps are providing us with. So it helps us to search the indicators. We also have the chart on the mobile phone, but you lose out in terms of the advantages of the natural methods we are already familiar with, and you lose the advantage of periodic continence because all of the apps suggest that you use a condom when in the fertile stages. Anyway, I'm going to finish now. So, the conclusion that most of these apps are not endorsed by experts in reproductive health, nor are they regulated by health agencies. Only 4 apps have published efficacy studies, and they have methodological limitations. They are useful to register the cycle instead of doing so on paper. It's done so digitally, and they can help you conceive. They are not recommended to prevent pregnancy without acknowledging a method of fertility, and no apps is better than the modern natural planning systems. And I would like to finish with this website where they have some very interesting publications on the health of women, where they say if we want to empower, I don't like this ever empower, but anyway, if we want to empower women, or if we want to encourage women to practice family planning naturally, we need to train them to discover the fertility indicators, and they have to interpret what's going on in their bodies, and they must understand what's going on with their cycles, because that is much more than what an app can deliver. Thank you very much.